Hey guys, it's Bridget with Sandy Seed Company, and I'm here in the garden and we're going to talk about squash. Specifically, this whole row is zucchinis, but if you're a brand new gardener, be aware that zucchinis falls underneath the umbrella that we call squash. Now, all of your squash, and that includes pumpkins as well, so zucchinis, pumpkins, squash, all of those crops like to grow during a certain time of the year when the conditions are favorable to the most healthy and robust growth possible. That means warm temperature and ample moisture in the soil. For us here in zone 9 and 10, that's going to be spring going into summer. For us in zone 9 and 10, typically that means we're putting down irrigation because we don't get enough natural rainfall to sustain plant growth. And these were direct seeded, I don't know, probably 6 weeks ago. And what do I mean by direct seeded? I mean that I actually physically took the seed and I directly planted it into the ground. Squash in general is a great crop to direct seed because it's a very big seed and it will easily germinate in soil that is moist and warm. That's really important. If you think that you can direct sow your squash early, like let's say you're trying to direct sow your seed in like February or March here in zone 9 and 10, they may germinate, but it'll take a very long time for them to germinate because the soil will be too cool. You're more likely to have squash plants that get premature powdery mildew and other diseases because they're not growing in the time of the year that they thrive, which is spring going into summer. Now, these squashes look fabulous and they are spaced out pretty nicely. I think I got a little heavy-handed and we've got a little baby one in here that's getting a little smothered. That's a perfect opportunity for us to talk about spacing. The biggest thing that I see with new gardeners when they're planting squash varieties is maybe they have a little 3x3 raised bed and they get all excited and they want like 4 different varieties of squash in there. Really, in a 3x3 bed, you might only get 1, max 2 plants in that particular bed. So you might want to consider planting your squash in a different area of the garden where you can let it really get big. Now, if you think you can get away with just 1 squash plant, there are some caveats to that. So squash plants are a dioecious plant, which what that means is that they have a male flower and a female flower, and we actually have 2 perfect little versions here. So the male has a little thingy, we'll call it a little thingy in there, which represents the male, and then we have the female. I'm sorry, I'm still like a 3rd grader with these male and female jokes. Sorry. The female actually has a immature little squash on it. Now the pollen has to go from the male to the female to be pollinated for this squash to actually grow. The way in which that happens in nature are insects, bees, insects, moths, ants, they all move pollen from one to the other. If you only have 1 plant, the likelihood of that happening naturally is going to be, less likely because you have to have a male flower open with a female flower. Now you can actually pollinate on your own, and that's where you actually just physically take the male flower. And you can actually see the pollen in there. And you take it and you pollinate the female flower. Now, that's enough. There's enough pollen in there. That should be pollinated fine. And it will actually grow to be a full, complete squash. In this case, a zucchini. Now, it's a little time consuming. You do need to do it at the earlier part of the morning for it to be the most successful. And a solution to doing this is just growing more than 1 squash plant. If you can get away with 2 in your space and you have adequate pollinators, then you shouldn't have an issue and you'll see that you get plenty of squash. Most of the time, for most gardeners, if you've got 4, 5 squash plants, you're gonna be giving squash to your neighbors. You're gonna be like sneaking onto their door and leaving them a big old basket of squash and running away because it will always give you way more squash than you possibly could eat. So keep that in mind. More isn't always better when it comes to squashes. Now, here's a little science lesson for you nerds like my videographer. So, squash is a fascinating plant in the sense that it crosses very easily between different varieties. So let's say we had, and actually we do have 2 different varieties here. This is one variety. You can tell that the leaves look different. And Spoiler alert, this is not powdery mildew. This is simply a variegated leaf. It's actually very beautiful, kind of silver looking. And you know it's not powdery mildew because you can't actually wipe it off. It's actually a part of the way in which the plant looks. This is one variety. Then over there, we have another variety. When those plants produce their babies, because I've got them all together, when these squash plants are pollinated, inevitably some pollen from that plant is going to make it over to this plant. Trust me, I've tried to have a conversation with the bees many times, but they're just really, they won't have it. They're all willy-nilly and they move pollen all over. It's one of the things that makes seed production very interesting. So that means this squash is going to cross with that squash. So let's say if you have a yellow squash and a green squash, they're going to cross. That first year, you're going to see that you're going to have the exact crop that you wanted. You'll have a yellow, you'll have a green. But the next year, if you save those seeds, you might actually get some weird combination of a yellow or a green squash. This is particularly troublesome if you grow like pumpkins next to squash, or if you have a wide range of squashes. That's when you can get these weird combinations of it's like a zucchini slash pumpkin that's not really super edible. So just FYI, squashes cross-pollinate very easily. So if you're going to save the seed from one variety that you're growing, and only that variety at a time. Okay, just to clarify, if you are saving seed from squash plants, that first year you will get the squash that you're supposed to get. Like this looks like my Black Beauty for sure, but it definitely crossed with my other squashes, and the following year when I save that seed, I will get some cross of the two. Not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily a good thing, it just depends on your particular setup. Now, if you are intent on saving a variety of seed, make sure with squash seed that nobody within a mile of you is growing any other squash, so that you get pure seed. And that's because bees fly really far. So just because maybe you only have one variety of squash here, neighbor next door might have a different variety, and a bee is not going to be like, oh, I'm not going to Miss Smith's squash. No, they'll go to that squash in the morning, then they'll come over to your squash, then they'll go back to that squash, and they're very promiscuous little things. So let's talk about spacing. That's probably the number one thing that people do incorrectly when they're planting squash for the first time. And here's a prime example. I have kind of gotten a little too crazy here, and these plants are a little too close. Now, although they might look nice, like this looks nice, and this guy looks nice, and that guy looks nice, they're too close because they're really immature right now, and they're going to get much, much bigger. The bigger these squashes get, the more plant matter, which also means the less airflow in between here, which is a way in which you can promote more powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a very common fungal disease that happens with squash, and it's where it literally looks like a little bit of powder is on your plants. Again, this is not it. That is actually the way that the plant leaf looks. The more plant matter you have, and the closer that you have these plants growing together, the easier it is for that fungal disease to proliferate very, very quickly. The other reason why you want good spacing is just so that the plants can get as big as they need to produce as much as you want. The smaller the plant, the more squished it is. You can actually see, like this plant, there's not a whole lot going on in comparison to this guy over here that is got a lot more space. There's nothing around it. It can grow big and happy. It's already pumped out quite a few zucchinis for me to eat in the kitchen, whereas this one's really kind of struggling. So it's always a good idea to make sure that when you're planting your squash, read the information on the back of the packet. Now, general rule of thumb is you want at least a foot in between your squashes, but there are a lot of things to consider depending on your particular variety. In fact, a lot of the squash varieties that we sell, like the striato, the dark star, those varieties are actually selected because they're really small and compact and easy to grow in smaller spaces. Some of your more heirloom variety squashes can get really, really big. So read the packet and find out what the seed producer recommends as far as spacing goes. Now, just because this is too close doesn't mean I've like totally, kicked the bucket on this particular squash. I can either dig it up, throw it in the compost, or I can dig it up and transplant it. The key thing that when you transplant this guy out is you want to transplant him out in the cool of the evening and make sure that he doesn't wilt at all during that process. So you want to make sure he goes into a nice pre-moistened area in the garden. You might need to put up shade cloth. There is some process that is involved in that. I'll probably just pull them up because again, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I got 7 zucchini plants here. It's more zucchini than I could probably possibly eat and share with the neighbors. So finally, harvest. When you're harvesting your zucchini, or really any summer squash, which is actually a great point I haven't brought up. Let's clarify this because I always see people in our master classes have a total paradigm shift when they're like, what? There's summer squashes and winter squashes? What? Okay, let me clarify. Zucchini is considered a summer squash because you actually eat the product in the summer. If you rewind to the beginning of the video, you'll notice that I mentioned that all zucchinis, all squashes are grown during the spring and the summer. So why are some called winter squashes? It's when you consume them that they have gotten that kind of incorrect name that's very confusing that I don't like, but here we are, so I will clarify. Zucchini is a summer squash because it has a fine, tender skin, and you want to eat it during the summer. This is not going to keep for months and months and months. In fact, it really will probably only keep for like a week in the fridge. So this needs to be eaten immediately, which is why it's called a summer squash. A winter squash is the squash in which you grow in the summertime, but you can keep or preserve and eat them in the winter. Those are all your hard-skinned squashes like butternut squash, your red curry squash. They are squashes that have the ability to be stored in your root cellar or on your counter and then eaten in the winter months. So don't let that confuse you. Just to clarify, all squashes are grown in the spring and the summer, but it depends on when you eat them that some people call them either a winter or a summer squash. Now take a look at the size of this zucchini. This is a perfect size zucchini for eating. You can let it get a little bit bigger, but bigger isn't always better. The smaller the zucchini, the more tender the flesh is, the less developed the seeds are on the inside, and just the higher the quality is for eating. So I'm gonna harvest them about this size. The other reason why I'm doing that is because I wanna keep harvesting and get the plant to produce more and more and more. And if I leave a zucchini on there to get overripe, I'm taking energy from potential new zucchinis that I want for my kitchen.